Marco Russo had exactly one rule for blind dates. Hide the watch, hide the car, hide the empire, and see who's left standing when there's nothing left to want. Tonight, in booth 4 at Aurelia, that rule was about to meet the one woman he couldn't test his way around. He didn't know that yet. Right now, he only knew that his water glass was sweating onto the tablecloth. His phone read 7:41, and she was late. Marco Russo was 38 years old and worth more than most small countries. He controlled shipping lanes, construction contracts, and 3 ports worth of quiet, untraceable money. Men who had never met him lowered their voices when they said his name in rooms he wasn't even in. His organization didn't ask questions twice, and neither did he. None of that was visible tonight. Tonight he wore a jacket with a fraying collar, a shirt that had been washed too many times, and boots that had actually earned their scuffs. He'd made sure of that. His watch, the real one, the one that costs more than the restaurant's entire kitchen renovation, sat locked in a drawer at home. On his wrist was a $12 knockoff that ran 4 minutes slow. His car, a dented 10-year-old sedan with a suspicious rattle under the hood, was parked 2 blocks away instead of with the valet. He'd told tonight's date he worked in logistics. Not a lie, just not the whole shape of the truth. This was the test. It was always the test. 5 years ago, Marco had watched a woman's eyes change the exact second she learned what he was worth. Watched interest sharpen into calculation. Watched warmth curdle into strategy. It hadn't been the only time. It had just been the time that taught him something he couldn't unlearn. Money didn't attract love. It attracted appraisal. People didn't fall for him. They fell for the line item. So now he tested. Every date, every time, no exceptions. If a woman could sit across from an ordinary man with an ordinary car and still want to stay, that was the only thing he trusted. So far, no one had passed. Marco, 18. He looked up. The woman standing at the booth was polished to a finish that caught the restaurant's low gold light. Sharp charcoal blazer, blown-out hair, the kind of posture that suggested she'd never once been told to wait for anything. Bianca. Hi. He stood, offered his hand. Her grip was brief, efficient, already moving past him. Her eyes did the math before she'd even sat down. The frayed cuffs, the boots, the conspicuous, glaring absence of a watch worth naming. He watched the temperature drop behind her expression, a full 10 degrees. Before she'd said a single word about it. "Sorry I'm late," she said, sliding in. She didn't sound sorry. "Traffic from the financial district. I had a call with my portfolio manager that ran long. No worries." Car took a minute to start anyway. He said it easily, almost cheerfully. A minute? Bianca's smile didn't move past her mouth. That old? Old enough to have character. The waiter appeared with menus and a wine list. Bianca didn't open either. "Cabernet. The 2019, she said, then glanced at Marco. "You. Water's fine." Her jaw tightened by a fraction most people wouldn't have caught. Marco caught it. He'd had a lot of practice. "So," she said, folding her hands on the tablecloth like she was opening a negotiation. "Your profile said logistics, route management mostly." Not a lie. He simply managed the men who managed the routes of several thousand trucks, among other things. Fascinating. Flat. Is there room to grow in that? My last boyfriend was a director at a tech firm, and even he found the cost of living here brutal. Marco leaned forward, elbows on the table, and let the silence sit for a second before answering. He already knew exactly where this was going. "It always went here. It covers what it needs to," he said. "Most of what I make goes to my responsibilities. Family stuff. It's not glamorous." "Right." Bianca's gaze flicked to the door, then back. "Look, Marco. You seem like a decent guy, but I'm going to be honest. I'm looking for someone who can actually keep up with my life. Not," she gestured, a small precise motion at his jacket. "This. I understand." He kept his voice level. It stung anyway. Even engineered, it was never the money that got to him. It was the total absence of grace in how people delivered the verdict. The waiter returned with her wine. "Ready to order?" Bianca was already standing, bag over her shoulder. "Something's come up. I have to go." She dropped a 20 on the table, barely glancing at it. "Fix the car before you try fixing this." She didn't wait for a response. Her heels struck the hardwood in short, sharp clicks all the way to the door. Marco sat alone in booth 4, staring at the coffee he hadn't touched, the 20 sitting there like a receipt for the evening. He told himself this was the point. Better to know now than after 6 months. He'd said that to himself 100 times, and it had never once stopped the low, tired ache that settled in afterward. He signaled for the check. But it wasn't the waiter who'd been serving them all night who walked over. It was a woman with dark hair pulled loose from a ponytail, the black apron tied at her waist, and a name tag that read, Elena. She was carrying a steaming mug of coffee in one hand and a thick slice of pie in the other, and she set both down directly on top of the abandoned 20 without asking. On the house, she said. Her voice had a faint rasp to it, like she'd spent the whole shift talking over a crowded room. You've got the face of a man who just lost a negotiation he didn't actually want to win. Marco laughed. It came out of him before he could decide whether to let it. It surprised him more than it should have. Elena noticed. Something in her expression shifted, just slightly, like she'd caught a fish she hadn't meant to hook. She didn't ask what he did for a living, didn't glance at his car outside, or comment on his jacket, or angle for a single detail that might tell her what he was worth. She just studied him for a second, the way you'd study someone worth being kind to, and nothing more than that. What were you actually hoping would happen tonight? She asked. Marco opened his mouth and found, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he didn't have a rehearsed answer. For the first time, someone had asked about him, not what he owned, not what he could offer, not what tier of life he could keep up with. He looked at Elena Hayes standing there in her apron, coffee steam curling between them, and understood one thing with total clarity. He did not want her to walk away. Marco just met the one woman who didn't care about his money, but she has no idea who he really is yet. Would you fall for the broke version of someone first, before knowing the truth? Or does the lie ruin it no matter how it ends? Comment PIE if you think Elena passes his test without even trying. Marco told himself he came back to Aurelia for the pie. That lasted about 4 visits before the lie stopped holding weight. He wasn't driving 20 minutes across town in a car with a suspicious rattle for cherry filling and a graham cracker crust. He was doing it for the 10 minutes between tables when I leaned against the counter and gave him her full, undivided attention, like he was the only thing worth looking at in the room. You again, she said the 3rd time, setting down his coffee without being asked. Does the Civic even make it home? Or do you just sleep in the parking lot? She's got more life in her than people give her credit for. She has a name? Everything with character has a name. Elena raised an eyebrow, unimpressed and delighted at once. And the job? Still thrilling? Still roots and logistics and the electric romance of shipping manifests? You'd be amazed how many people find trucking fascinating at parties. I would not. She didn't ask what he actually made. She didn't ask where he lived or whether the job had benefits, or any of the quiet reconnaissance questions he'd learned to recognize instantly after years of practice. She asked what music he listened to when no one was watching, whether he was a good liar, what he'd wanted to be at 7 years old before the world talked him out of it. She asked like the answers actually mattered to her, not like she was building a file. It unsettled him more than the questions Bianca had asked. It was so much harder to defend against. By day, Marco existed in a different universe entirely. He sat behind a desk on the 40th floor of a building he owned outright, in an office where the air itself seemed to know his name. Associates chose their words like they were diffusing something. His head of security checked every entrance twice before Marco arrived, and once more after he left. Men who ran shipping conglomerates cancelled other meetings rather than keep him waiting. He moved millions of dollars a week through companies that were entirely legal, and several that weren't, and no one in either category looked him in the eye without calculating the cost of disappointing him first. By night, he peeled all of it off like a second skin. He changed out of the suit, left the real watch in the drawer, took the old car out of the garage where it sat between 2 vehicles worth more than most people's homes, and drove to a restaurant where a waitress in a black apron called his car ugly to his face and never once flinched at him. With Elena, he wasn't the boss. He wasn't Marco Russo, the name people said carefully. He was just a guy who was bad at parallel parking and worse at small talk. And it turned out that was a version of himself he actually liked being. But she wasn't entirely what she seemed either, and Marco had spent too many years reading people not to notice. There was a night a heavy-set man in an expensive coat walked into Aurelia, and Elena went rigid behind the counter for exactly 2 seconds before she recovered and smiled her usual smile. There was the way she could read a table of strangers in a glance. Who was arguing? Who was lying? Who was about to walk out on a check with a kind of precision that didn't come from waiting tables? There was the question a regular had asked her once lightly about whether her family was still in the city, and the way her whole face had closed like a door. There were the phone calls she took in the back office. Voice low, door shut, coming back out a few minutes later with her jaw set in a way that had nothing to do with a wrong catering order. And there was the thin white scar across her left wrist that she covered without thinking whenever she caught someone looking at it. Marco's instincts, sharpened over a decade of surviving in a business where instincts were the only thing standing between him and a bullet, told him clearly, she is hiding something. He didn't ask. Everyone deserved the privacy he wanted for himself. One night, near closing, he waited until she untied her apron and asked if he could walk her home. She looked at the sleek black car idling curbside, the one he kept forgetting to send away, and wrinkled her nose. Absolutely not. We're taking the Civic, and if I'm risking my life, I want it to at least match the aesthetic. They drove through a city gone quiet and gold under the streetlights, and the conversation, without either of them deciding it should, turned honest. Marco found himself saying things he didn't usually say out loud. That he'd stopped trusting people's motives a long time ago, that he ran a version of a background check on almost everyone who got close, that it was exhausting, and he didn't know how to stop. Elena was quiet for a moment, watching the streetlights slide across the windshield. Maybe that's because you keep giving people reasons to prove you right, she said. He didn't have an answer for that. It sat in his chest the rest of the drive, uncomfortable and true. He pulled up outside her building. She was already reaching for the door handle when she stopped. Across the street, a dark sedan sat parked at the curb, engine running, windows tinted past legal. Nothing about it should have meant anything. Marco had driven past 1,000 parked cars that meant nothing. But Elena's face changed, just for a second. A flicker of something sharp and old moving behind her eyes before she smoothed it away. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Fine." She smiled too quickly. "Just thought I recognized someone's terrible parking job. Thanks for the ride, Marco Bell." She was gone before he could say anything else, jogging up the steps, disappearing through the door without a backward glance. Marco didn't believe her, not for a second. He sat there a moment longer, watching the dark sedan in his mirror, before he finally pulled away. Upstairs, Elena listened to the Civic's engine fade into the city noise before she moved. She turned all 3 locks on her door, one after another, then knelt at the corner of her bedroom and pried up a loose floorboard she'd sealed herself 2 years ago. Underneath, wrapped in cloth, was a small metal box. She carried it to the kitchen table and opened it with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside, an old photograph, creased soft with handling, a folded document, its edges worn thin from being read too many times. She stared at both for a long moment in the silence of her apartment. "They found me," she whispered. Elena didn't mention the photograph or the metal box or the man in the dark sedan, and Marco didn't ask. But something between them shifted after that night. A quiet agreement to keep moving forward without looking too hard at what either of them was standing on. He started taking her places deliberately unglamorous, not because he needed to maintain the disguise anymore. He'd have driven the Civic to the moon at this point without thinking twice, but because he'd discovered, almost by accident, that he liked this version of a life. They ate tacos off a cart on 5th, with hot sauce dripping down their wrists. They walked through the park near her building until the streetlights came on, arguing about nothing, whether pineapple belonged on pizza, whether her taste in music was a crime against nature. They drank bad coffee in a cafe with sticky tables, and Marco found himself laughing more than he had in years he could count. He began to wonder, somewhere around the 3rd week, whether the test had stopped being a test. Maybe he wasn't pretending anymore. Maybe this, the terrible car, the cheap coffee, the woman who argued with him about pineapple, maybe this was just his life now, and the other one, the 40th floor and the men who lowered their voices, was starting to feel like the disguise. It nearly fell apart on a Tuesday. They were at the taco cart, Elena laughing at something he'd said. when a man in a grey suit walked past, stopped, and did a double-take. Mr. Russo, Marco's whole body went still for half a second. The kind of stillness that had kept him alive in rooms where mistakes got people killed. "Sorry," he said, easy, unbothered, the mask sliding into place so fast it startled even him. The man blinked, uncertain now. "I could have sworn. You look exactly like someone I used to work with. Marco something. Happens more than you'd think." Marco shrugged, took a bite of his taco like his heart wasn't hammering. Common face, apparently. The man apologized, laughed it off, kept walking. Elena didn't say anything. She watched the man's back until he turned the corner, then looked at Marco for a second longer than was comfortable. "Common face," she repeated, testing the words. "Guess so." She let it go, but something in her expression had changed. Not suspicion exactly, more like a door left slightly ajar that hadn't been before. What Marco didn't know was that Elena had her own reasons for not pushing. She'd spent years learning not to ask questions whose answers she couldn't unlearn. Before Aurelia, before the apron and the name tag, Elena Hayes had been someone else entirely, a name that didn't matter anymore. A financial analyst so precise and quietly brilliant that powerful men had trusted her with the architecture of their fortunes without ever wondering if she'd notice what was underneath it. And she had noticed. Money moving through restaurants and shipping firms and construction outfits that didn't add up, laundered clean through books that looked, to anyone but her, perfectly ordinary. Her father had been the one who tried to do something about it. He'd gone to the wrong person with the wrong evidence. Certain the truth would matter more than the men it threatened. It hadn't. Till you've enent. Elena had run with what she could carry and nothing else. A new name, a new city, an apron instead of a corner office. A life built specifically so that no one would ever again look at her and see someone worth silencing. The evidence her father died trying to expose was still hidden, still waiting, still the single most dangerous thing she owned. She hadn't planned on falling for a man who drove a car nearly as suspicious as her own past. That night, walking her to her door, Marco stopped on the stoop and said something he hadn't planned to say either. "Can I tell you something?" "Always. I don't trust easily. It's not a personality thing. People change the second they find out what I have. I've watched it happen enough times that I stopped being surprised by it. I just wanted to know once if someone could look at me and see the actual person instead of what I could offer them." He exhaled. "I've spent years wondering if anyone would stay if I had nothing at all." Elena was quiet for a long moment. "Then maybe you should stop asking people to prove they love you by making them fail a test," she said, not unkindly. "You're not giving anyone a real chance, Marco. You're giving them a trap and calling it a relationship." It landed harder than he expected. Harder because it was true, and because no one had ever said it to him with that much honesty and that little cruelty at the same time. "I don't know how to stop," he admitted. "Start by trusting the person in front of you instead of the test you built to protect yourself from them." He looked at her, really looked, the porch light catching the line of her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes that never once flinched from him, and something in his chest gave way. He kissed her. She kissed him back, one hand coming up to rest against his chest, like she'd been waiting to do exactly that for weeks. For the first time since he'd started this ritual of disguises and rejections, the test didn't matter. Nothing about her lifestyle, her opinion of his car, her reaction to his job. None of it was the point anymore. He wanted her to know the real him, all of him, the 40th floor, the men who lowered their voices, the name that made people nervous. The thought terrified him more than anything in his actual, dangerous, complicated life ever had. He didn't say it. He let the moment end gently instead, walked back to his car, and told himself there would be another night for the truth. He was wrong about how much time he had. 2 days later, one of his men set a manila folder on his desk without a word. Marco opened it. A photograph. Elena, taken from a distance, walking out of Aurelia in her apron, unaware of the camera. Beneath it, a single typed line. "We found the woman from the old case." Marco's face went completely still, the easy warmth of the last few weeks draining out of it like water through his fingers. He read the line again. Whatever Elena was hiding, whatever had put that scar on her wrist and that fear in her eyes outside her apartment, it wasn't separate from his world after all. It was already inside it. Marco told himself he was only being careful. He had people who could pull threads quietly, discreetly, without ever letting the subject know they'd been touched. He told himself it was protection, not betrayal. That if someone was hunting Elena, he needed to know why before he could keep her safe. What came back over the next 2 days unsettled him more than he expected. A name that didn't match the one on her apron. A financial background too sharp for a woman who claimed she'd waited tables her whole adult life. A gap of nearly 3 years where Elena Hayes, in any traceable sense, simply hadn't existed. Whoever she used to be, she'd buried her carefully, professionally, like someone who'd learned exactly how dangerous being found could be. He meant to ask her about it gently, in his own time, in the way he'd have wanted to be asked. He never got the chance. That was the night Moretti called an emergency meeting at the warehouse on the East Docks, a shipment problem that couldn't wait. The kind of business that required Marco Russo, not Marco Bell. He left Elena's number half-dialed on his phone, promising himself he'd call her after, and driven to the warehouse in the black car instead of the Civic, dressed in the suit instead of the jacket. He didn't know Elena had followed the wrong instinct that same night. A name overheard at the restaurant. A face she thought she recognized near the docks. A decision to trust the sharp, careful part of herself she'd spent years trying to bury. She told herself she was only checking. She didn't expect to find anything. She found Marco, not the man in the frayed collar who joked about his terrible car. A man in an immaculate black suit stepping out of a car worth more than her apartment building, surrounded by 4 men who moved like they'd trained for exactly this, flanking him, scanning the street, deferring to him with a stillness that had nothing to do with friendship. "Mr. Russo," one of them said, holding the door. Elena stood frozen in the shadow of a shipping container, watching the man she loved become someone she had never met. Mr. Russo. She'd read that name before, not recently, years ago, buried in the financial records that had gotten her father killed. Marco Russo. One of the names circled in her father's handwriting, back when she still had a father, back when she still had a real name of her own. She didn't move until the warehouse door closed behind him. Then she walked back to her car in the dark, hands shaking, and drove home, replaying every conversation of the last month like she was hunting for the exact moment she should have known. The broke job, the dead car, the cheap jacket, the watch he never wore. Every small specific line delivered so easily she'd never once questioned it. She wondered, staring at her own reflection in the windshield, whether she'd been a mark from the very beginning, whether the coffee and the pie and the honesty on his porch had all been part of something larger. She still didn't understand. She was waiting in her apartment when he finally called, and she didn't let him get past hello. "Come over," she said. Now. He knew from her voice that something was wrong. He arrived 20 minutes later, still in the suit, and found her sitting at her kitchen table with the lights on and her arms crossed and an expression he'd never seen on her before. "I saw you tonight," she said, "at the docks." Marco went still. "Mr. Russo," she said, watching his face. "That's not a common face, is it?" He didn't try to deny it. There was no version of tonight where denial would have meant anything. "No," he said quietly. "It's not. So say it." "My name is Marco Russo." He sat down across from her, slow, deliberate, like a man disarming himself in front of someone who could hurt him. "The job, the car, the jacket, none of it was real. I have money, more than you'd believe. I have people who work for me. It's not clean money, Elena, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend it is. The watch, locked, in a drawer. I never wear it on dates. I stopped trusting anyone who could see it. The blind dates. All of them. This was what, some kind of test? Yes." Her jaw tightened. "So what part of you was real?" The question hung there, sharp enough to cut something. "The part that fell in love with you," Marco said. "That was never a performance. Everything else, I'll explain all of it, every piece, for as long as you want. But that part was real from the first night, from the pie." Elena looked at him for a long moment, something warring behind her eyes. Then, quietly, she reached under the table and set the small metal box in front of him. "Then I owe you the same thing," she said. "I'm not just a waitress. I haven't been for a long time." She opened the box. The photograph, the folded document, worn soft at the creases. "My real name isn't Hayes. I worked for a financial network years ago, legitimate on paper, filthy underneath. I found out what they were really doing. My father tried to expose it. They killed him for it." Her voice didn't shake, but it was close. "I ran. I built a whole life out of nothing so no one would ever find the woman who saw what she wasn't supposed to see. People have been hunting me for years, Marco. That's the truth I've been hiding." She unfolded the document and slid it across the table. Marco scanned the columns of names, the routed accounts, the dates, and stopped cold on one line near the bottom. A name circled twice in someone else's handwriting. A name connected to the men who had orchestrated his own father's death. Years before Marco had ever taken control of the empire he now ran. He read it again to be sure. It didn't change. "This name," he said slowly, turning the page toward her. "I know this name. He's connected to what happened to my father." Elena went very still. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The pieces were rearranging themselves in real time. Her father's murder, his father's murder. Two separate tragedies suddenly threaded through the same conspiracy, the same men, the same buried money. "They're not just hunting you because of what you know," Marco said, and his voice had changed, gone flat and cold in a way Elena hadn't heard from him before. "They're hunting you because what you know could burn down the people who built my entire world." Whatever this had started as, a disguise, two people hiding from each other in plain sight, it wasn't a romance anymore. It was an alliance, and it was already dangerous. Marco Russo, Mafia boss, and Elena just found out, the hard way. Now both of their darkest secrets are connected to the same conspiracy. Do you think love survives once all the lies are out on the table? Elena laid out the rest of it on her kitchen table like a woman, finally setting down something she'd carried alone for too long. The ledger, a set of financial records so precisely documented they'd taken her nearly a year to compile before her father died, mapped a network of laundered money moving through shell companies, shipping firms, and construction outfits that all trace back to the same handful of men. Secret accounts spread across 3 countries, payments routed to organizations that existed only on paper until they didn't, and names. Careful, damning names of businessmen who wore legitimacy like a second suit while quietly bankrolling operations that would end their careers, their marriages, and possibly their freedom if any of it ever saw daylight. One name appeared more than any other, circled and recircled in her father's increasingly urgent handwriting. Vittorio Moretti. Marco went cold reading it. Moretti wasn't a rival in the ordinary sense. He was the rival. The man who'd spent a decade probing for weaknesses in Marco's territory, always just careful enough to avoid outright war. If Moretti's fingerprints were on the deaths of both their fathers, then the danger circling Elena wasn't adjacent to Marco's world. It was the center of it. "You're not staying here alone," Marco said, already reaching for his phone. "I'll move you somewhere secure. Round-the-clock protection, a location no one." "No." He looked up. "Elena." I said no. She crossed her arms, steady in a way that made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. "I spent 6 years building a life where nobody controls where I sleep, or when I move, or who watches me eat breakfast. I'm not trading one kind of prison for another just because you're scared. I'm trying to keep you alive. You're trying to manage me like one of your accounts." Her voice sharpened. "You don't get to decide my life just because you're afraid of losing me." Marco opened his mouth to argue and found, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he didn't have a counter ready. He was used to controlling every variable in a room, where people stood, what they knew, how much risk they were allowed to carry. It had kept him alive. It had also, he realized now, kept nearly everyone at arm's length. "Okay," he said finally, quieter. "Tell me what you need instead of what I think you need." Something in Elena's shoulders eased just slightly. "I need you to trust that I can protect myself. I've done it before." He nodded, even though every instinct in him rebelled against it. Protecting someone and controlling someone, he was beginning to understand, were not the same thing, no matter how similar they felt from the inside. The peace didn't last a full day. By the following afternoon, a rumor had already moved through Marco's organization like smoke under a door. That the waitress from Aurelia wasn't who she claimed to be, that she'd been feeding information to Moretti's people for weeks, that Marco's judgment had been compromised by a woman planted specifically to compromise it. It was clean, plausible, and devastatingly well-timed, which told Marco exactly who'd started it. Two of his most senior men came to him directly, uneasy, urging him to distance himself before the situation became a liability he couldn't undo. "She's not the problem," Marco said, flat and final. "Moretti wants you looking at her instead of him. Don't do his work for him." It cost him something to say it that firmly, a crack of doubt in men who'd been loyal to him for years, a fracture he'd have to manage later. He didn't care. He said it anyway. That night, he went to Elena and told her the rest of what he'd never told anyone. Not the wealth, not the operations. The parts underneath those. How he'd taken over the organization at 26 after his father was murdered, and he was the only one left who could hold it together. How every decision since had been made with the specific, exhausting awareness that trusting the wrong person could get people killed. How the loneliness of that had settled into him so completely he'd stopped noticing it as loneliness and started calling it caution instead. "I built the blind date test because I didn't know how else to find out if anyone could want the man instead of the armor," he said. "You're the only person who ever did." Elena watched him with an expression that had nothing guarded left in it. "I love you," she said simply. "Not the empire. Not the danger. You." She reached across and took his hand. "But if we're going to survive whatever's coming, there's one condition. No more lies. Not small ones, not protective ones. None of it. I need to know the truth stays between us even when it's ugly. No more lies." Marco agreed, and meant it more completely than he'd meant almost anything in his life. For one night, it felt like enough. The call came the next morning, while Marco was still at the office. 3 words from one of his men that stripped everything else out of the day. Elena's gone missing. He was at her apartment within 20 minutes. The door had been forced, not broken. Someone skilled, someone who hadn't wanted to draw attention. Inside, the apartment had been searched with methodical precision. Drawers emptied, the loose floorboard in her bedroom pried up and left gaping. The metal box was gone. Her phone sat on the kitchen table, screen cracked, a single message open on the display. "Come alone if you want her alive." Marco stood in the wreck of her apartment for a long moment, and something in his face went completely, terrifyingly still. The version of him that had built an empire out of knowing exactly what he was capable of when it mattered. His men were already gathering outside, waiting for direction, waiting to see which version of Marco Russo had just walked back into the room. He turned to them, voice quiet, absolutely without mercy. "Find Elena." A pause, cold enough to fill the space between his words. "And bring me everyone who touched her." It took Marco's people 6 hours to find her. 6 hours he spent doing the one thing he'd never allowed himself to do in this business. Nothing useful. He paced his office while phones rang and men worked, and every minute felt like a debt accruing interest he wasn't sure he could pay. The location came back at 2 a.m., an abandoned textile warehouse on the industrial edge of the city, the kind of building that had been empty long enough for the address to fall off official records. It had Moretti's fingerprints all over it, remote, defensible, no witnesses for half a mile. It was a trap. Marco knew that with total certainty before his car had even left the garage. He went anyway. He gave his men their positions with the flat, mechanical calm of someone who couldn't afford to feel anything yet. Perimeter secured, exits covered, no one moves until his signal. Then he walked in through the front alone, unarmed hands visible, because Moretti wanted a negotiation, and Marco needed to see Elena before he decided how this ended. Inside, floodlights rigged from a generator lit a wide concrete floor stacked with rusted machinery. Elena sat in a metal chair in the center of it, wrists bound, 2 of Moretti's men flanking her. Her hair had come loose from its usual tie, a bruise darkening along one cheekbone, but her spine was straight, and her eyes, when they found Marco's, were furious rather than broken. She'd been talking. Marco could tell by the tight, controlled expression on the nearest guard's face. Elena had been feeding them something slowly, deliberately, a trail of half-true financial details specific enough to sound real and useless enough to buy time. She'd memorized enough of her father's records over the years to build an entire false map of where the real ledger was hidden, and she'd been walking her captors down it for hours, watching them chase nothing while she waited to find out if anyone was coming. "There he is," said a voice from the shadows near the loading dock. Vittorio Moretti stepped into the light, unhurried, a man who'd clearly been enjoying the wait. "Marco Russo. I was starting to think you'd send someone else to do your worrying for you." Let her go, Vittorio. Vittorio, this is between us. It's always been between us. She's just finally made that obvious. Moretti circled Elena's chair slowly, and Marco's whole body went rigid watching it. You know, I almost admire her. 6 years of running, and she still had the nerve to feed my men garbage for half a night. I said let her go. Not yet. Moretti smiled. First, I think it's time you understood exactly what you're standing in the middle of. Marco's eyes flicked to Elena. She gave him the smallest shake of her head. Don't, not yet. But Moretti was already talking, and there was no stopping a man who'd waited this long to be heard. Your father found out I was moving money out of the organization years before you ever took over, Moretti said. Skimming, he called it, like it was something small. He was going to expose it. So was her father from the other direction. The financial trail led straight to the same accounts, the same names. 2 men, 2 investigations, closing in on the same truth from opposite sides. I couldn't allow either of them to finish. Marco felt something in his chest go very still and very cold. You killed them both. I removed obstacles. Moretti spread his hands, almost pleasant. And then I did something better. I made sure you took over the empire afterward. Grieving, furious, exactly the kind of leader men would fear and follow without question. I helped build the fear around your name, Marco. I wanted you strong enough to protect the operation and naive enough not to look too closely at where the money actually went. It worked beautifully. Until her. The floodlights hummed in the silence that followed. Elena's eyes stayed fixed on Marco, steady even now, even bound to a chair in a warehouse that smelled like rust and old machine oil. Power requires betrayal, Marco, Moretti went on, almost gentle. You'll learn that eventually, one way or another. Everyone who's ever held real power has stepped over someone to get there. I simply helped arrange your first step. I'm here, Marco said quietly. Not to Moretti. To Elena. Just those 2 words. Low and steady, cutting through everything else in the room. Her shoulders dropped a fraction, some of the tension in her leaving all at once, like that was the only thing she'd been waiting to hear. Marco's men moved on his signal a half-second later. 3 points of entry, fast and coordinated. The guards flanking Elena down before either of them could raise a weapon. Marco crossed the floor and cut her free himself, hands shaking despite every effort to keep them steady, and for one long moment neither of them said anything at all. He just held her, her face pressed into his shoulder, both of them breathing like the last several hours had finally caught up all at once. I'm sorry, he said into her hair. I should have. You came, she said. That's what matters. Behind them, Moretti hadn't moved, watching the reunion with something like disgust. You're choosing her over everything I gave you. You didn't give me anything. Marco turned, and whatever softness had been in his face a moment ago was gone entirely. You took my father. You took her father. You built a war and handed me the sword and called it a gift. This is how power works. This is how you work. Marco's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I'm not becoming that. Not for the Empire, not for you, not for anyone. He nodded once and one of his men produced a tablet. The false ledger Elena had begun compiling on burner accounts the moment she'd started dating a man she suspected was more than he seemed, quietly duplicating fragments of her father's original records into something that could be released without exposing the original. Enough evidence to be devastating. Enough to end Moretti without waiting for a trial that would never come in their world. It went out within the hour, routed to exactly the people who needed to see it. Allies who'd stood beside Moretti for years and would not stand beside a man now proven to have orchestrated the murder of 2 respected men for his own gain. By morning, half his organization had already turned, unwilling to go down with a ship this thoroughly holed. Moretti's empire didn't survive the week. Marco stood outside the warehouse afterward, Elena beside him, the night finally starting to lighten toward dawn, and felt something settle in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. Relief, grief, something like the beginning of an ending. But when he looked at Elena, really looked, he saw it too, the exhaustion, the weariness that hadn't fully left her eyes even now. She had survived his world tonight. That didn't mean she believed she could survive it forever. The weeks after Moretti's collapse were the busiest of Marco's life, and none of the work felt like the work he'd been doing before. He spent long days going through every arm of his organization with a precision he'd never bothered to apply when fear alone had been enough to keep people in line. He removed the men who'd doubted Elena the moment a rumor gave them permission to. He cut ties with the parts of the business that had only ever survived on threat and silence, and quietly funneled resources into the legitimate side: the shipping firm, the construction contracts, the parts of the empire that could stand in daylight without flinching. It was slower than the old way. It was also the first work in years that Marco didn't feel he needed to hide from anyone he cared about. Somewhere in the middle of all that restructuring, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in a long time, thinking about what he actually wanted, instead of what the empire required of him. He was fairly sure of the answer. He was less sure he was allowed to have it. Elena had been quieter since the warehouse. Not distant exactly. She still met him for coffee, still teased him about the Civic which he'd stubbornly refused to get rid of. But there was something careful in her now, a held breath he couldn't quite talk her out of. One evening, sitting on her fire escape with the city going orange behind them, Marco finally said the thing he'd been circling for days. "You don't have to stay in any of this," he said. "The danger's mostly gone now, but it's never fully gone, not in my world. You deserve a life that doesn't come with security details and dead men's ledgers. An ordinary one." Elena looked at him for a long moment, something between amusement and disbelief crossing her face. "Marco, I have never once in my entire life had an ordinary life." She said it plainly, without self-pity. "My father was murdered for finding the truth. I spent 6 years hiding under a different name so nobody would find me. Ordinary was never on the table. I'm not asking for it now." "Then what are you asking for?" "Honest." She turned to face him fully. "I don't need you to pretend to be poor. I don't need the flannel and the terrible car and the fake job. I never needed any of that, Marco. That was always your test, not mine. I don't need you to hide what you have or become someone smaller so I feel safer around you. I need you to stop hiding. That's it. That's the whole ask." Marco sat with that for a moment, the city noise drifting up around them. Then, slowly, he reached into his jacket and took out the watch. The real one. The one worth more than most people's homes. The one that had spent years locked in a drawer every time he sat across from someone he was testing. The one piece of himself he'd always treated as a liability instead of a fact. He set it down on the fire escape between them, not hidden, not explained away, not softened by a joke about a bad alternator. "I spent years hiding everything valuable about myself," he said, "because I was terrified people would only ever want the things, not the person underneath them. And then I met you, and it took me embarrassingly long to realize I wasn't just hiding my money. I was hiding myself. All of it. The parts I was proud of and the parts I wasn't." Elena looked at the watch, then at him. "So don't anymore," she said simply. He didn't. 2 weeks later, Marco walked into Aurelia and asked for booth 4. He wasn't wearing the jacket with the fraying collar. His suit fit the way suits were supposed to fit on a man who'd stopped pretending otherwise. The watch caught the low gold light of the restaurant when he checked the time, unhidden, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it cost. Outside, parked properly with the valet this time, sat a car that had nothing to prove. The staff who knew him now greeted him by name, his actual name, with a kind of easy familiarity that had nothing to do with fear. Word had gotten around, the way it does, about the man who used to come in wearing someone else's life. Elena came out from the back a few minutes later, out of uniform for once, and slid into the booth across from him with a slice of pie and 2 coffees. "Tables requesting the usual?" she asked, setting 1 cup in front of him. "Something like that." He glanced at the pie. "Still free?" "Not anymore." She fought a smile and lost. "You're rich, Marco. Obscenely so, as it turns out." "I checked," he laughed. The same laugh from the first night, unguarded, surprised out of him. And it felt exactly the same as it had the very first time, except now there was nothing underneath it he was keeping from her. "Fair enough," he said. "I'll pay full price for the pie and for everything else I owe you. You don't owe me anything." She reached across the table and took his hand, and then, instead of staying across from him the way she always had before, she got up and slid into the booth beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I just wanted to sit next to you for once, not across from you. Not watching to see if you'd flinch. I'm not going anywhere." "I know." She said it with a certainty that had nothing to do with tests or proof or watching someone fail a rigged game. That's the whole point. We don't need any of that anymore. No disguises, no fabricated jobs, no borrowed poverty, no false names hiding either of them from the people who might come looking. Just two people who had, in their own damaged ways, spent years protecting themselves from being truly known and had finally, carefully, chosen to stop. When they left the restaurant that night, Marco's driver was waiting at the curb with the car he actually owned, the one that belonged to the life he no longer needed to hide. He waved him off. Instead, he and Elena walked her hand in his down streets. Neither of them was in any hurry to leave, past the restaurant where a broke man in a bad jacket had once been given coffee and pie by a woman who thought he had nothing. She'd stayed then when she believed there was nothing to gain. She was still here now, knowing exactly how much there was. That Marco understood. Walking beside her under a city sky gone soft with evening had been the only test that ever mattered, and neither of them had needed to fake a single thing to pass it. No more disguises, no more tests. Just two people who finally chose honesty over fear and everything they had to survive to get there. If you made it to the end, comment Argelia and let me know which chapter hit you the hardest. Subscribe now so you never miss the next story. New episodes drop every week.